Hello. Over the years, there have been many influential artists, writers, designers, and business leaders who have charted the course of 40k, Warhammer Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, and indeed Games Workshop as a whole. Amongst those individuals, there are plenty of famous names, but there have long been those who have steered the course from behind the scenes, supporting creatives and influencing decisions. This is my interview with one such important figure, who worked at Games Workshop for 36 years, from the very earliest days of Citadel to the very end times of Warhammer Fantasy, who Black Library described as being one of the driving forces for Games Workshop's imagery, and who, in his final role for the company, was responsible for the IPs of Warhammer Fantasy and 40k. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Alan Merrett. Alan, thank you so much for joining me to have a bit of a chat about your time at Games Workshop over the years. I wonder if we might start with maybe even a bit of a potted history of your time at Games Workshop, because you started in the quite early days at Citadel, is that right?
Yes, hi. That's quite correct, Jordan. I joined the very fledgling Citadel miniatures in 1980. And at that time, Citadel was a partnership that was between Brian Ansell, if you remember, and Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, who happened to be the owners of Games Workshop at the time, which was also a very small fledgling business, although it had already acquired a massively important reputation in the UK, because it was the importer of Dungeons and Dragons to the UK. And so just on that basis alone, it was enjoying a very high degree of media attention for a tiny little hobby company, and was also shaking up the UK gaming scene quite remarkably. So I think that Citadel had about 6 employees when I joined. And my job was to sit in front of a casting machine and empty molds, basically opening up the molds and taking out the little metal figures. And my responsibilities grew over the first weeks, into being allowed to actually operate the machine, turn it on and off, and feed it with metal ingots and things. And eventually I got to do hand casting and all sorts of interesting things. I learned all about how to make white metal figures. Brian was very much the boss. He was very much hands-on chap at the time. And we used to have daily chats about all kinds of things. Very, very little of those chats were about actually the business. They were mostly about music or concerts, or he was convinced I looked like Graham Parker from Graham Parker in the Room, and so he assumed that I was a huge fan, which I was, coincidentally. So it was kind of relaxed. I never for a moment thought that the job would last more than a few months. It was a tide me over. My actual ambition was to go back into further education, do some more exams, and then go to university, or go back to university, because I'd left the previous summer. But that never happened. I just sort of stayed there. The business grew. It was reasonably successful. I was just a caster. And then one day, the guy who was my supervisor came into the casting room and said, "Oh, I'm leaving." And I said, "Oh, surprise." He said, "Yeah, I'm off. I won't be in on Monday." That's all right. Okay. So there I was, casting miniatures in this little room and wondering who my next supervisor would be, when Brian turns up and he says, "Oh, do you want his job?" I was like, "Oh, right, okay, yes, please." So I got to be the Brian's 2CI for a brief moment in time. widened my eyes to broader issues to do with the Citadel business, like having to fill out orders and talk to people on the phone about their order, and organize people to not only cast the miniatures but to pack the miniatures and make the molds. And so I learned a bit about mold making, and that became my kind of my role for the next 2 or 3 years as the company grew. We merged with Games Workshop. What really happened was that Brian sort of dissolved the partnership because he wanted to do other things, and he went away briefly for about a year to do other things. So I became a Games Workshop employee by default. Steve and Ian came up to the Citadel factory, which was in a completely different part of the UK from Games Workshop. We were in a little town called Newark-on-Trent, which is in Nottinghamshire. It's quite close to Nottingham, but a very long way from London. And but one day, Steve Jackson and Neil Livingstone came up to the factory, which was very unusual, to basically ask me how I felt about Brian. I said, well, he was a really great boss, and he knew what he was doing. He understood toy soldiers, and if only we had someone like Brian running the business, we would be successful again at selling toy soldiers. And then so they, and that was part of the process of them rehiring Brian as the general manager. And that moment when Brian came back to Citadel was probably when things really changed. And in my mind, it went from being a temporary job I was doing to tide me over into being actually a real job, because Brian's energy and his ideas and his creativity and his forceful personality, put it that way, started driving us to massive success. We were doubling the turnover every couple of weeks, every month or so. It was a new record level of sales. We were doing exciting things with product ranges. It was good fun, actually. It was like a every day was exciting, energetic, and very cooperative as well. So lots of ideas about how molds were made, how miniatures were designed, how ranges were packaged, how we marketed things. The growing group of us at the centre of it had a huge sort of part to play in a lot of those decisions and a lot of that movement, even though it was Brian's final say so, because he was the boss. And that period, including the move to the Eastwood factory, probably cemented Brian's reputation as an effective manager of a reasonably sized business. So such that when Steve and Ian said, "Oh, we want to take a step back," Brian was the obvious candidate to manage the Games Workshop business for them. But Brian had bigger ambitions, organised a management buyout where he bought Games Workshop from, well, he bought a majority stake in the company and became I suppose he would have been the chief exec then, but I don't think we ever called him that. I think he was just Brian. Or boss, mostly.
Sure.
And that period then was super exciting. We moved Games Workshop's operation up to Eastwood, consolidated a lot of the back office and warehousing and all the print buying duties all became consolidated. which stripped a lot of cost out of the business, which was good for Brian, and good for us. We were all enjoying the fruits of that success in different ways. Yeah, and that was again a very not wholly. It wasn't a party every day. It was work. We had immense challenges. Some of them were quite ludicrous, actually, totally left field, weird things. Can I tell you this story? I think I can tell you this story. One day, somebody turned up at the factory in Eastwood, and or I can't remember exactly how it went, but I've got a feeling I might have been phoned at sort of 1 o'clock in the morning. I was in bed, and I think the phone rang, and I think it was Diane Lane, who was Brian's partner and general sort of head of admin. And she said, "Oh, you need to get to the factory immediately. And we've got a problem." And so imagine driving across Nottinghamshire to get to this factory in the dead of night. And apparently we'd had a notification that the metal we were using for casting was radioactive.
Wow.
And so we had this emergency meeting trying to figure out what on earth we were going to do, given that, you know, if we had been selling radioactive miniatures, that might be a little of a PR problem. But more importantly, how on earth were we going to survive if we couldn't make miniatures? And that was a very fraught weekend. And it transpired it was all rubbish. It was completely unfounded, and nothing came of it. But it was strange things like that happened quite often.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, what was your role at that time then? So were you still in the casting rooms, or had you sort of taken on other responsibilities by that point?
I think technically I was the factory manager. One of the things about working for a small business, even a successful one, is that you're a bit of a jack of all trades. So you end up learning and doing a bit of everything, and then you sort of gravitate towards things that you seem to be more successful at handling than other people, or that you make less mistakes at handling than other people would. So I kind of ended up being the sort of the factory manager for a period, and that basically meant I was in charge of mold making and casting and packing and stock and order fulfillment. All fell into my kind of overall remit. And then we had departments like mail order that would be in the warehouse, that although I technically didn't have line manager responsibility for, they were in my warehouse.
Right.
And it was my stock. so there's lots of crossover and lots of blurred areas. But the one thing that I was doing at that time was, and I'd been doing for a couple of years, was I was handling all the sculpting. And the reason I was handling the sculpting is because I was, at one stage, I was one of only 2 people, including Brian, in the business who could make a master mold. Because that used to be Brian's job. Brian was a superb craftsman. He was very good at making things, and brilliant with his hands. And he taught me how to make master molds, where you were really taking the original, very delicate putty masters and making a mold of them without utterly destroying them in the process. And I had an aptitude for that work, so I became the master mold maker. And as a result of that, I became the link between the sculptors, who were all living and working remotely from the factory, and the business and the process.
Right.
So I was also as factory manager, I was also kind of miniatures manager at that point as well. Again, so I was telling the miniatures designers what to make.
Right.
Of course, I had to make sure that that was okay with Brian. And whenever they visited the factory or came to see the factory, it would always be Brian they would see, because we treated them very, very carefully. They were a unique and special resource, very, very highly valued. So it was fine to have the illusion that Brian was still their boss and telling them what to do. So I was merely passing on orders to Brian, because I was mostly having to make all this, because he was off doing important other stuff.
So what would have been the sort of main product lines that you were producing at that point?
Oh, crikey. Obviously, Warhammer was the big one. We'd only just started to do 40k, but not in any meaningful way. We've made limited edition Space Marine model, which was quite an interesting job, and a few other things. But there were all kinds of ranges, lots of license ranges, Doctor Who, Middle Earth, various weird and strange things. Spaceship.
I mean, because there was a real creativity of like just trying lots of different things for those Warhammer and Rogue Trader lines and others. What was sort of influencing your decisions in like, let's try making this, or let's do an army or a unit of these guys? How were those decisions getting made?
Well, a lot of it was to do with the overall context. I mean, Warhammer was any and all things fantasy, and started off being basically, we have lots and lots of fantasy models, and we've created a game that uses sort of generic fantasy models, and so quite a lot of the early C ranges, for example, were all just how many different ideas do we have for an orc? Let's whack them in. Or what can we do with dwarfs? And some of the ranges had very offbeat and strange little miniatures in them for different reasons. So I think the dwarf range had a big game hunter, the dwarf with pith bomb it and a blunderbuss, and things like that. It was weird and exciting. So we had this bedrock of make fantasy figures. There were certain subjects that we knew would be more successful sales-wise than others, and so I was constantly looking for opportunities to have more of those made. We always had far too many goblins for reasons, but we never had enough Chaos Warriors for reasons. And so part of my job was thinking about which sculptors had aptitudes for which ranges. And there's a simple rule of thumb: if a designer's not excited about working on a miniature, then there's no point having them working on that miniature. They have to be invested. They have to be excited about and have some sort of empathy with the design or the ideas of it. And you get to know those things quite quickly. Really, you get to know what particular designers like and what subjects they excel at, and then you just try and match those together with some kind of commercial imperative. In the eyes of Brian, most weeks I failed, so I would come and say, "Why are you having so and so make these? And don't you know we need more of these other things?" Yeah, yes, Brian, but this, that, and the other. I go, "All right. Why don't you get so and so to make loads of these?" And I go and get that designer to make those things, and then Brian would say, "Why did you do that? We can't sell anything." So it was a lot of it was about balancing expectations both within and that has never changed. That's never ever changed. And I suppose it's probably still happening today in Games Workshop. it's creativity within a context. Now, some designers would just full on completely embrace it, actually come back with complete filled out backgrounds and ideas for them. And it's just Jez Goodwin was particularly good at that. So he wouldn't just design miniatures; he'd actually tell you exactly the histories and the gods of these miniatures and how they interacted with each other and all sorts of stuff. And these are the things they put on their shields. And very, very deeply involved and invested in what he was doing. Other designers just more like brilliant sculptors and brilliant designers and do fantastic miniatures, but it was not one of those out and off we go again. And they all had their place and all had their value, but constant juggling act really that never got easier as the years went on.
Yeah, because I imagine there is that tension between the creativity and then the sort of commerciality of a given range or game, and sort of trying to balance that out of, well, we really would love to do this because people are super passionate in the business about it, but we don't know if it will sell.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then you have to imagine that there's an internal market. The bigger the company got, the more organized that presentation to the internal market had to become.
Right.
So the internal marketing, in other words, persuading the sales companies that this was really a good product and that they would be able to sell it, was a constant pressure on the design process. Absolutely, completely shapes it. So you can. There is a mythology that circulates around the fandom, which is it's a great. It kind of goes like this. Oh, Games Workshop used to be great when it was by hobbyists for hobbyists. You know, when it wasn't a business that was being driven by tawdry commercial imperatives. And I go, I wonder what day that was, because in all the years I was there, that was the main driving force for the business was, is this commercial? Can we sell it? We didn't do anything that we didn't think was commercial. But obviously you have higher expectations for some things than others, but we never willingly put any effort into anything we thought wouldn't sell or was just being done for as a sort of as a frippery or as a personal sop to somebody. Even some of the most deeply uncommercial things we did, we didn't know they were at the time. but in any kind of publishing venture where you're taking thoughts, ethereal concepts, and you're turning them into product, whether that's a piece of written prose, a game mechanic, a piece of artwork, a miniature, a kit, anything, a piece of music. Whenever you're involved in any endeavor like that, even if it's got a commercial outcome, you want to do something that sells, and is liked by people. You have to get the people that are creating the thing engaged. They have to feel creative. You have to build an environment where they can be creative, where they're not the ones that are worrying about those commercial imperatives. You take that away from them so they can just design or create in a space that feels encouraging and productive in that way. So a lot of the job is to take away those commercial pressures from designers and writers and such like. You say, don't worry about that aspect. You worry about the things you control. But I don't think Games Workshop ever really was by hobbyists for hobbyists. It was always by hobbyists for commercial success.
Sure. I mean, the sort of story goes with certain passion projects that like the Realm of Chaos and the Orc books for 40k, of course. Yeah, absolutely. They were sort of really driven by, okay, so Brian's really super invested in these and wants to tell these particular stories. Was that true for those kinds of books? I mean, there must have still been a commercial aspect to that decision as well.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Brian had a very strong view about printed product, particularly, and he wanted us to produce gem-like products with incredible quality and a very high degree of finish and a depth and a gravitas to them. That was, and he wanted us to make that kind of product because he thought that kind of product would be successful, would be commercially successful. There was a lot of very hurriedly produced, very and cheaply produced gaming product around. The history of wargaming rules in the world was that they were usually, very, very cheaply produced and sold for half a tanner. That's an old English coin that's worth about 5 cents in American terms. So the world of wargaming, the world of toy soldiers, the worlds of hobby gaming were not exactly famed for the quality of the literature that associated with them. And Brian just thought that that the books should have those qualities. Those were the things he liked, and he did have very strong commercial instincts. And the problem is that those products are even more terrifyingly difficult to produce than simple 32-page RPG modules, which we found very hard to produce anyway. We invested vast amounts of time and resource in those products, and we didn't get the immediate sales that all that investment really needed to make it sensible. But it was absolutely a commercial decision, and borne out really by the long-term success of all of the products. They have outlasted those investments. They just weren't returning them very quickly.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can still buy copies of Realm of Chaos at Warhammer.
They're reprinting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But then and I guess it does speak to absolutely that the longevity of the decision was a good one in terms of, if your time horizon for returns and the profits are over 30 or 40 years instead of a couple of years, then it's very successful in that regard. But as the company moved sort of beyond Brian Ansell, and a lot of that stuff was kind of put to one side almost, wasn't it? With the GW books, the fiction line, the Flame Publications, and the RPG modules for Woofrup, and then there was a real concentration on the sort of core games and the miniatures again. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Well, after the launch of 40k, which completely transformed the company, that's an exciting period. So the process of creating 40k was tortuous and only involved a very tiny number of people, because it was never thought it was going to be quite the success it ended up being. The bulk of the early work was Rick Priestley sitting in he may even been at home quite a lot of the time, but in a lonely office, the door locked, just bashing away at keys, grumbling a lot about how narrow the brief was, because Brian had given him a very specific brief. It must include every model that we have with a gun in our range. Okay, well, including all the Doctor Who range? Yes, including them. Whoops. Yeah. So clever students will find the reference to Daleks in the original 40k book, but it's quite subtle, or maybe not, depending on your investigative powers. So Rick beavered away on the manuscript, and as it slowly turned into a thing that we're actually going to publish, we play tested it. So small group of people were involved in play testing 40k. Exploratory artwork was created, and then it kind of built momentum, but only within the studio. Or most of the artwork was commissioned from freelance artists, because we didn't employ any internal artists other than John Blanche and Tony Ackland, and they did a bit of work on it, but they were mostly working on the other things as well. So a great mass of the art in 40k was generated outside of the studio, and then we had to pull this book together, and it was all kind of I wouldn't say under-resourced, because we did put a lot of effort into it, but there was no great massive plan for it. It was all us trying things out. So we would and I'll give you an example of that. So Brian wasn't very engaged in us designing huge ranges of science fiction models. So part of the plan was that we would people would convert fantasy models. So let's make packs of guns and blasters and things and cannons, and cast them up as weapon packs, and then sell them, and then people can just convert their orcs, cut the axe off and stick a gun there. Same with their elves and skavens and whatever, Chaos Warriors. Chaos Warrior with a gun is a science fiction evil bad guy. I don't know. So there was an idea that that we wouldn't invest a lot in the miniatures, and then of course people say to me, "Oh yeah, but RTB01, the famous box of plastic Space Marines, that wouldn't have been a casual design or product idea." And it wasn't, but it was really a test of a plastic tooling idea that we had to try and make plastic tooling a bit more doable, because the plastic tools were super expensive. And so that original Space Marine kit sat alongside the skeletons that we were doing. And the idea was that we were making little inserts that would fit into a bigger plastic tool, halving the cost of the tooling. And it was a test to see if we could make that kind of tooling work commercially. And we knew Space Marines would be popular. We had no idea 40k would be, but Space Marines had already proven to be very popular because of the LE2 miniature and the little set of Space Marines that Bob Naismith had designed a couple of years before. But when 40k actually hit the streets, it was probably the first time that we nearly broke the company through success rather than through failure. So, because it was insane. It was bonkers. Everything sold out. We had immense pressure suddenly landed back onto the studio. So, oh, you've done a fantastic thing. Now you've all got to work 12-hour shifts to get enough new 40k product out to satisfy this monster you've created. So the result wasn't that putting our feet up and lighting up a cigar and enjoying ourselves. It was hard work. Suddenly we had to do like real work. It's like, oh no, we've got to get another supplement out. And then Brian was banging on about army lists. We need army lists, and where are all the 40k models? What are you playing at, Merrett? Where's the range? And so we were making models hand over fist, and everybody was getting involved. And Brian was telling the designers to make this model, and he was coming into the studio and saying, "No, I told Bob Mason to make these, and I told Ali to make those." And I have to go around and check that they knew what they were doing, and it was really, really crazy. And then we take these new designs to Rick and say, "Oh, we need some rules for this." And Rick would be really grumpy. He'd say, "Well, Brian told me they couldn't put rules for those in, and now we've made the models, and I've got to do them." Yes. Yeah, it was really, really crazy. So that was back end of the 80s. The success of 40k immediately sparked the hardback era for that version of Citadel and Games Workshop, because obviously suddenly we had a really best-selling hardback book. It was like, yes, great, let's do more. So we did Warhammer. I always get this wrong. It's Warhammer 3rd edition. That's 3rd edition, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then and we did the Realms of Chaos, and then we did Wolfrup, and we did Call of Cthulhu hardbacks, and we started doing the RuneQuest hardbacks, and basically we were looking for anything that we could put into hardcovers. So, striking all these licensing deals with American companies, and yeah, that was kind of fun. But yeah, because we created a beast, so we had publishing more hardcover books, and more more 40k miniatures, and yeah, that was fun. Seriously, it was fun, but very high pressured, and we made tons of mistakes, and some of which mattered a lot, and some of which didn't really matter. We got into trouble all the time because we kept making wrong turns, and
is there any of those that sort of stand out now as like an obvious, okay, why did we do that? or have they all sort of just merged into a kind of
merges into time? I remember I was pretty much project managing the Space Hulk game, so in terms of production, and rules were being handled by the fantastic Richard Halliwell, rest in peace. He absolute genius games designer, created this fantastic game, and we play tested. People loved playing. It was great, and we used to have huge meetings to talk about the Terminators and the Gene Stealers, and we're making them in plastic and how we're going to do it, and that was all great, and we got that done, and Brian was very central to this whole process, and then and I would getting the floor plans done. I think Gary Chalk did those. Dealing with him, and then I think Space Hulk was the kind of, I think it might have been the reason why we actually gave Dave Gallagher and Wayne England full-time jobs in the studio, because of or it was around that time that they joined full-time. So that's very exciting, having to manage their input, and it was all tickety-boo. And then the game was finished and off, and then I get a phone call from Brian, and I think I was in the office very early in the studio, and he was in the factory. Obviously, copies of the game had landed on his desk, fresh from the factory. And he phoned me up and he told me off and said how much I destroyed this product. And I said, "Why, Brian? What have I done wrong?" And he said, "It's a closed system. It's not an open system. It's closed." And I was like, "Oh dear." So yeah, that's a weird one. Never quite understood why that would have been a particular problem, but it turned out all right in the end. We sold vast quantities of it. We made loads of great supplements. But Brian's upset momentarily that it wasn't an open game system. So there weren't rules for using all the other 40k miniatures in it. No, I didn't want to explain to him that would have required a sort of 400-page rule book. But
and of course, in White Dwarf, some of those rules did turn up down the line, didn't they? And other, you could bring other miniatures in and use those as well.
Oh yeah, I mean it was just, I don't know, it's just the classics, sort of the ups and downs. So and that was probably our most successful board game launch since Talisman. Talisman was always number one, no matter when we ever did it. So, yeah, it was strange times, but very exciting. A roller coaster of emotions. But anyway, 40k was so massively successful. It kind of propelled Games Workshop up another notch, and was really the spark that set off another period of really strong growth. And I think we got to about 30 stores in the UK, and I think we had half a dozen stores in America. I think so, around about that time. That weren't the American stores weren't working out very well for reasons I don't know fully. But obviously we'd had a massive influx of new staff as well during that period. So I don't know what the head count would have been, but it was I think the studio, we had about 40, maybe 50 people working in the studio at that time. Which was kind of, what?
Yeah, far cry from the 6 or 7 when you first joined Citadel.
Yeah.
Then
Where did all these people come from? I was trying to work it out, and then I go, "Oh, there's someone else in there." Maybe it wasn't quite as high. Maybe it's 40 people. Anyway, it's quite a lot of people. And then we'd had various different studio managers. I kind of was never officially studio manager, although I was kind of the most senior manager in the studio for about 3 weeks at one point when I first joined it. But then my old pal Richard Ellard became studio manager, and then Richard went off to run the American business, and Tom Kirby got introduced to me, and he said, "Oh, Alan, this is Tom Kirby," says Brian. So, Mr. Kirby. He says, "Call me Tom." "All right, Tom." And Tom's going to be, who'd been brought in to run the retail chain, was the new studio manager. So Tom Kirby was studio manager probably round about that time, sort of 80, 87, late 87, for a little while. And it was Tom, and I can't remember the exact sequencing of events, but Tom stopped being. Sorry, I'm going to get this a little bit confused now. What happened was that Brian decided to go and live abroad for health reasons, and wanted to kind of find an exit strategy. He'd obviously organised his management buyout, would acquired a majority stake in Games Workshop, and he wanted to move on, do other things. So business moved to Tom, who, I don't know whether Tom became general, but Tom was trying to organise a management buyout. And whilst that was happening, Brian had gone off to live in the Caribbean somewhere to help him with his health issues, and Tom was running the show, so he stopped being studio manager, and I think that was when Rick became studio manager.
Right.
And we moved the studio to Castle Boulevard, and then it changed again. We became the Tom Kirby's Games Workshop, and that brought about another massive cultural shift to the business, and another sustained period of a different kind of growth. Under Brian, most of our growth had been home-based. It had been in the UK, and it had been through remote handling of overseas stuff. The exception being America. So we had a headquarters in Baltimore, and the fantastic Richard Ellard running it. And Brian used to visit and spend quite a lot of time in America, because obviously he recognised the massive commercial potential of the US market. So he was spending a lot of time there up to that point. But that was about the sum total of Brian's interest in overseas. Otherwise, he was more concerned about what we were doing in the UK and that US business. So when Tom took control of the business, he was convinced and proved correct that the business would work anywhere, that the Games Workshop model would work in any country. And so he was very interested in expanding, not just in the UK and not just in the US, but everywhere: America, Canada, Germany, France, Spain, Australia, wherever we could. And I think that ambition is still in Games Workshop today. I think Games Workshop would I think even now would be looking at all the markets around the world and saying, how can we get some cash out of that place? Because we assumed, Tom rightly ascertained that the kinds of people that wanted to buy toy soldiers from us and play war games or paint them or just store them under their bed, they're the same people around the world. They just speak different languages, but it doesn't matter what race, creed, or colour they are. There's loads of people. They all want it everywhere around the world. And the only thing that obstructs that are the sort of local trading conditions. So in places where it's extraordinarily hard to open retail stores, it's or expensive to do that, it's a bit difficult to get a Games Workshop store open. In places where it's difficult to repatriate the profits, it's hard to set up a Games Workshop business. So, for example, India, it's a really difficult place to open retail stores because you have to open them in expensive malls if you want to, sell luxury Western style goods, which makes it challenging to open low cost Games Workshop stores. But it's really, really difficult to extract profits from India because the local trading conditions make that a difficult thing to do. So but Tom's all over expanding and pushing the business out around the world.
Did that lead to any? Obviously, there's the sort of translations and moves to simplify what might be on a card, for instance, so that it can fit, because you need to now do it in multiple languages and stuff like that. But did those international markets influence the kind of games that were getting made or the lines that were being produced, or let's emphasize this particular army over another one? Were those kind of decisions affected?
Not in relationship to the internationalization of the company, but in terms of the making Games Workshop's products more accessible, that they come to the same place, I think. So right. We had a bit of a messy product range when Brian left the business. We had, 40K, we had, there was 9 or 10 various supplements, some of which were reprints of Warhammer, of White Dwarf articles, and it was all kind of messy and difficult. And it was like, how do I play 40K? Well, you need this book, this book, this book, and you need this thing, and then you need this thing. How do I know which miniatures to buy? We haven't done a book that tells you that. so it was all a bit, tricky. It was all a bit difficult. So one of the earliest things that Tom asked Rick to do was give me a version of 40K and Warhammer Fantasy Battle that I can sell in a supermarket. That was basically it, and that was the well, I don't think he said super. He might have said in any shop. So that was the decision to go for the big box versions of the core games, and still works today. They're still happening today. But Tom's goal, or his objective, was to have a product that he could sell anywhere that was self-contained. So you bought this, it had miniatures in it, so you could actually play with the miniatures and you could paint them and you could understand. And there'll be a bit of paper in there that told you how to paint them, and the rules and some exciting background. So you put them into context, and that was, and it might have had a price. There might have been a price objective, and we need to be able to sell it for under 50 quid. There might have been that. I don't know for sure, but that was very much the brief. So, and again, I get this wrong. So it'll be 4th edition Fantasy Battle and 2nd edition 40K.
Yeah.
Get that right. Well, we didn't think in those terms at the studio, by the way. We didn't think in edition terms. We just thought, what's the next one? Oh, doing 40K again. Rah! Roll sleeves up. Start thinking about Latin-like phrases and poetry that's based on anyway, whatever. So so that was that. So no, Tom wanted a much more accessible product. His philosophy was that any kid of anywhere in the world, any kid will be excited by our toy soldiers and want to play games with them or paint them or just put them in boxes under their bed. So why don't we? What stops any kid buying our product? And it's accessibility. It's having a context for it. So it was all about making it easier to purchase and get into it.
And that was the start of the army books and the codex books and things like that as well, right? Which serves a similar purpose, I guess. Yes,
and again, we didn't at that time. I guarantee we had no thoughts in our head that it's okay, we can slap out an Empire book because it's all right, in 3 or 4 years we'll be doing another one. we didn't have those thoughts in our heads. I can assure you, when we did those army books, they were permanent fixtures in the firmament. These were permanent statements about the miniatures. So in fact, the imperative to update the army books didn't arise as a result of updating the core rules sets. So it wasn't like when we did the next version of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, we thought, oh, we'd have to go make new army books for all those armies. the imperative to update the army books was because we wanted to make new miniatures and release new miniatures onto the market. And what we discovered quite early on was, because the army books and the codexes were sort of very successful at consolidating excitement and interest in the miniatures that were about to be released alongside that book, they became tent pole, is that the right word, tent pole releases,
right?
And we found it really hard to get the internal market excited about miniatures releases that weren't accompanied with an army book or a codex. So yeah, that was a painful lesson, because we tried other ways to do it. We tried other products to not make us have to do a new army book each time, but those products weren't as successful and weren't perceived internally as doing that same job. So yeah,
it's fascinating, isn't it? That, because the sort of general feel is that or one might assume that the army books is kind of right. Well, this is the catalogue of what we're going to be producing for this army, for this edition, and we'll sort of follow that, and because there's almost a sense of that unbridled version of the worlds that existed in the earlier editions of the games, where it was just, we're just going to release something cool that someone thought of and just add this, and now you can have this unit or this squad. Now it's all defined in the army books or the codex, and that's kind of driving what we're then going to produce. But yeah, it sounds like there's more of a symbiotic relationship between the different aspects of what's being made, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good word, symbiosis. And so it's very hard to publish a book that had rules in for miniatures that you couldn't buy or didn't exist, because that breaks that symbiosis in that way. And similarly, difficult to release new models that aren't in the army book, because that breaks the link the other way. And so yes, massive amount of pressure results, and that gets released in internal and external criticism of the producers, i.e., aka the studio. What are they playing at? What are you playing at? When I got a letter from a lovely letter one day, as in the mid-80s. It was written in crayon, which was great, and it was from the Dark Lord of Nagaroth. He was upset because he was demanding his chariot. Where is my chariot? Where's my chariot, Mr. Merrett? You will burn in hell if you do not bring me my chariot immediately. I was like, oh my gosh. So I had it stapled on my office wall for a little while. It's quite fun. But that was so. Yeah, I didn't know that the Dark Lord of Nagaroth had crayons. But no, we used to get a lot of stick internally and externally. If we released an army book, we didn't have the miniatures for it, for all of the entries, and that made it really, really particularly difficult with fantasy, with Warhammer Fantasy going forward, because the legacy ranges were huge for some of the armies, and of course, every time we did a new edition, we had to include all of the legacy units and characters, even if we hadn't made models for them before, because the expectation was people might have converted models or that they were in fact things that we had an ambition to make. So we had this enormous problem where, with Fantasy Battle particularly initially, where that legacy expectation limited how much new things you could put into the project, and that eventually was one of the factors that kind of broke fantasy. began to have an impact on 40k decision making when we got to 3rd or 4th edition codexes, but nowhere near as problematic as it was with fantasy. So I'll give you an example in 40k, the Eldar. So the Aspect Warriors were a very central part of the Craftworld Eldar idea. Jez Goodwin made these really lovely, almost timeless versions of the Aspect Warriors right at the very beginning of us publishing them. And I mean, it must have been 10 years or 15 years later, we were still effectively selling those same designs. And part of the problem was that whenever we went to look at the Eldar range and said, oh, what are we going to do now for the Eldar? And go, well, we've still got all these legacy metal codes or resin codes that we want to turn into plastic kits. But let's face it, we can't put all of the effort this time round into doing plastic kits for all of the Aspect Warriors, because that won't be as exciting as doing something new for the. And so, yeah, you can imagine it was just difficult. I noticed recently they have started doing plastic kits for all the Aspect Warriors. So it's about 20 years after they should have done. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, there's some long-serving Eldar troops, I think, and Skaven as well over the years when they're. I guess it's testament to Jez Goodwin's skill and the designs that he was putting together.
Yes.
So,
well, actually, we were selling metal miniatures that were older than many of our fans. Yeah. When did you design this? About 3 years before you were born, Sonny. Good Lord.
So obviously that's sort of continued now. We've got the big starter boxes for 40k and for Warhammer Fantasy, the army books, the codexes, the ranges sort of being refreshed and moving forward a bit. What were you doing during that period as sort of Tom Kirby's international expansion really took off and the business really started to change from what it had been in the Brian Ansell days?
I was through the 90s. I was Mr. Studio. So and initially under working with Rick was my boss as the studio manager for quite a large part of that time, and then under Robin Dews became studio manager sometime in the 90s. I can't remember exactly when. So, but my job was really became more and more focused on design, miniatures design, artwork, layouts, and so the look and feel and the visuals, and various times involved with rules and games developers. So that was kind of my thing, was really product focus. But I was also a member of Tom's sort of senior management group. So Rick and myself, and then Rick, me, and Robin would be part of the broader group of people that would be looking at right across the whole business. And we'd have these sometimes entertaining but mostly very dull meetings, sitting in this very large office at HQ with all these people from the factory and sales and that, and different parts of the business, accountants, and they would variously give us hard time. We'd have to explain what we were doing and why we were doing it, and then quiz them on why they weren't selling enough of them and all that stuff. Terrible bun fights and stuff. So I was doing that as well. So I had a perspective on the broader business, but my day job was managing designs, managing artists, managing the layout and stuff, and coordinating with people that were be, responsible for delivering those things. And that was good fun, actually. To be honest, it was a good period. The 90s was a hoot on the whole. I got to go all around the world to talk about products to Games Workshop staff and customers all around the world. It was a very entertaining and mostly positive environment to work in, and we were, some of the quite a large number of colleagues had been with the business for over a decade or more. So we were a band of brothers still, just about. And that was good fun. But of course, during the Tom Kirby period, we also started to do a lot more licensing. So there was again, it was something that Tom felt very strongly about, that 40k and Warhammer and Blood Bowl and all the things that we created had a value beyond our market. And I have to be completely honest and say, we didn't all subscribe to that view initially. And the reason is because we come from such humble beginnings and such, it seemed crazy to us that, this tiny little insular British company that had really been founded in the back end of nowhere had created something that people might want to license, to do a computer game for and things like that. It was all a bit of a mystery, really, and a bit kind of futuristic thinking. But we came round to it eventually. I mean, so as licensing went through ups and downs and successes and failures and stuff, it became clear that there was a lot of opportunity there to do successful things in places outside of our normal market. And I would be the one that would be dragged along to meetings with licensees or hang on, I get it wrong. So we're the licensor and they're licensees.
Right.
So I'd be dragged into meetings and say, "Oh, this is Mr. Warhammer." Yes, and our licensing manager would say, "Yes, you can ask him any question you like about Warhammer, and I'll have the answer." They drop me in it like that. So luckily, I never got asked any really difficult questions. Normally, I'll get asked things like, "What's Skaven like then?" But so I became a useful resource for licensing. The licensing team was 3 people, so it's very helpful for them to have. And also, we didn't want them to be just crashing into the studio and suddenly going, "Oh, look, these are designers. Talk to them." You're like, no, don't do that. We don't like talking to the actual designers because you might upset them, or you might get them distracted, or they might promise to do stuff that we don't want them to do, because resources are scarce. And so we were very protective about the studio as a resource. So part of my job was to act as a kind of a gatekeeper to keep the licensing, and indeed keep salespeople out of the studio. So we don't want interfering.
Is it true?
Brian Ansell always maintained that the studio had to be an ivory tower. It had to be separate from sales business, particularly, and the reason being that they would ask it to do things that to get like a cheap win or something, and that would be it would be too chaotic and too random and too dangerous to allow that. Don't trust salespeople. It's like, no, you have to at some point. But he was very convinced that was part of the reason why the design studio was for the large part, physically separated from the office, the head office. And then even when we were all together on the same site, consolidated on the same site, access control limited who could go in and out of the studio. It's like our secret box, you're not allowed in.
I was just going to ask you on that licensing question. There's always been rumors that, and you may not be able to talk about this, I don't know, but that Blizzard had originally been looking to create a Warhammer PC game, which was when they ended up, and it didn't work out, so that's why they ended up creating Warcraft. Is that true that you're aware of?
I have no idea.
Right, fair enough.
It may be true. There may be a grain of truth in it. I think well, if you got like I don't know for sure if I'm allowed to say.
Sure, that's all right.
But there might be an element of truth.
Sure. And then the other thing that always occurred to me around, and it was a question sort of with us as fans, why there was never a TV show or a movie set in Warhammer or 40k, I guess in particular, like through the 90s and the 2000s. Is it just a cost thing and a difficulty in kind of bringing those worlds to life?
Okay. Opportunity, there wasn't one because we were small, even though we weren't in the hobby. In the world of hobby games, Games Workshop and Warhammer and 40k were massively significant. In the rest of the world, they weren't really. The biggest reason is because of the way that media is structured business in terms of businesses, how they're commercially structured makes it different from licensing a computer game. We used to get despite what I was saying about the size of the business, we through the 90s especially, through the 90s we used to get increasing numbers of outreach contacts from the media, from what would you call it, moving media, from TV and or movies.
Sure, yeah.
And all of the opportunities were sort of along the lines of, we'd like to make a 40k movie, brackets, Skaven movie, brackets, whatever movie. It'll be really great for you. It'll give you vast amounts of publicity. All you have to do is give us £1 million so of seed funding, and you'll make millions. And they'll go, oh, okay, how will we make millions? How will our 1 million investment turn into multiple millions then? And they would say, well, because you'll get like all the back end merch. They call it now merch, don't they? Merch sales. And we go, yeah, but we already get all the merchandising income because we make the product. So what else do we get then? How do we get broadcast monies and things like that? Do we get monies from other people? And they go, oh no, your money comes from all comes in the back end on the merchandising. Just look at how your man did with Star Wars, and you go, yeah, no, that's not going to work for us, because number one, if we haven't got £1 million to get you, and number two is we kind of already own all the merchandising rights. We want to have money from the actual process itself, and that was always the sort of essence of it. Really, was that there was never any. It's not like you go to a film company and they go, okay, we're excited about the opportunity. We'll give you an advance against future and royalties of, a couple $100,000, or anything like that, which is actually the way that most other licensing works. So it's really, that was really about the difficulty of structuring a deal. We came very, very close on a couple of occasions when I was at Workshop to striking actual, real, meaningful deals. But they all came to nothing because of those issues. I'm not entirely sure what Games Workshop are doing now. I'm not privy to any of that information, but I think the hook up with Henry Cavill and Netflix or Amazon or whoever it is. I think it's Netflix, isn't it? That might be quite interesting. And I have absolutely no idea how Games Workshop are structuring that deal. But the big difference between the modern Games Workshop and the Games Workshop back in the day when I was there is that the modern Games Workshop has very, very, very deep pockets because it's been making such fantastic profits. It has enough money to completely fund the production of a film or TV series from its own bank account. So we were never in that position.
Sure.
I wish them well. I'm quite excited about what they're going to do.
I'll be very intrigued.
Fingers crossed that they don't lock it up. But I've had to sever my deep emotional connections to Warhammer and 40k since I left the company because I'm not there anymore. I'm not part of it anymore.
Well, I mean, on that note, so you left in 2016, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that would have been shortly after the end times and the end of the Warhammer Fantasy world. I just wondered what your sort of thoughts and I guess recollections from that period of decision-making, I suppose, of we're going to bring the Warhammer world to an end. We're going to take a look at creating a brand new version of the fantasy universe that we can sort of explore. Do you sort of remember how that kind of all kicked off and how that progressed from in the boardrooms and in the decision-making spaces?
Well, yes. So if you look back at Games Workshop's financial reports from sort of 2006, 2007, that sort of period, through the noughties and the teens of the new century, and it's self-evident that we were finding it hard to get back to sustained, healthy growth. It was a difficult period for us, and we were having to do lots of work internally to get some momentum back into the business. And some of the structural problems we had with some of the products were beginning to become really tricky and difficult and obstructive. So we were not wanting to tedious talking about some of these things. So the net result was we needed some exciting, radical things to do with product, and the trend for the business internally to be focused on and excited by 40k at the expense of just about anything else had become stifling. So there was a real point during that period of restructuring, recosting the business and rethinking the kind of core philosophy about what the product ranges could look like. That there was a real risk at that point that we might have to become a 40k company. And I know lots of Warhammer fans out there go, "Oh, that's typical Games Workshop," because you just didn't invest in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. If only you'd invested in it like you did 40k, everything would be fine. It would be a top best-selling game, just like 40k was. And the answer was, yeah, it wouldn't. No, we had done that. We did look at numbers. We weren't winging it. In those years, we had massively sophisticated analytical tools to look at what we've been doing and the successes and where things were working at. And the long, short and tall of it was that actually, 40k was actually remarkably healthy, and everything else was less healthy. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that Warhammer Fantasy was dying, but we had a big problem. I talked to you earlier about the internal market and the external market. Well, the internal market, for years, we've been fighting against the sales expectations to do with the different product ranges. So, in a very narrow sense, it's almost like you go, if it's a 40k month, i.e., roughly 40k releases, everybody was super happy. All the sales guys, they're really happy. They're all going to make their targets. All the sales managers and all the stores and all the sales departments are all cheering because they think, oh, great, we've got a chance of actually winning a bonus this month, or of hitting our targets, and it'll be great. And 9 times out of 10, they did. And so they were super happy. And then if we gave them anything else that month, if we said, well, this month is a Necromunda release, an epic 40k release, a Battlefleet Gothic release, a Warhammer Fantasy release, anything that wasn't 40k, and it would be, you just make my job harder, says every salesperson in the company. Now, that's not literally true of every single salespeople, and there were certain stores where obviously the manager and the staff would be massively invested in Fantasy Battle, and they'd be so excited and brilliant at their jobs anyway that they'd still smash their targets and do really well, and that would be great. But unfortunately, that wouldn't be everybody in the company, and it also wouldn't be all of our customers, because fun enough, the customers had exactly the same reactions. So there would be fantasy fans that would be super excited. Oh, yeah, Wood Elves this month! Hooray! It's the best day ever. It's like my birthday. All my birthdays come together, and most people would be going, Wood Elves. Why aren't you releasing Space Marines? Or when are you going to get around to releasing those Eldar or Sisters of Battle or whatever? So, and we tried all sorts of things. So we tried releasing both things together. So we said, okay, every month we'll release something to do with 40k and something to do with something else, or only 40k. And of course, what would happen then is that the factory would come back and say, why have we put these Fantasy Battle things next to the Warhammer things? Because we're only going to do a few of them. It's getting in the way. It's stopping us being able to make as many of the 40k ones as we need to fulfill all the orders. And you go, oh, crikey. So it was a kind of a difficult problem, and it got worse as the business grew. That difference in the way that products were received got bigger, and that's the end of it. That's really the thing that said. So what you're going to do in that circumstance is you can either decide to not do things, and we constantly had to make those decisions about specialist games through the years, and I know that gets people going to be a bit weirded out. So what was the thinking behind the specialist games? Well, we released the product, we sold it as much as we could, we invested in it as long as we could, and we tried to get as many people excited about it for as long as we possibly could, because we want to sell as many of these as we possibly can. And then eventually the market literally says, yeah, that's it now. We've got all the ones we want of those. Can you do something else now? So at that point, you have to kind of be realistic and say, okay, we'll stop doing that for a bit, then maybe we'll come back to it later on. But it's quite hard to do that with one of your tentpole properties. With Fantasy Battle, it's a bit hard to say, okay, we'll just put it on the back burner for a couple of years, and then we'll come back to it, because that's as good as killing it. And you go, we can't do that. So we've been thinking about this issue with Fantasy Battle for a long time. Now, again, I know there'll be people out there that'll go, oh, but that's because they just didn't invest in it. Well, we did invest in it quite heavily, but unfortunately, at the end of the day, you have to go, we need to get a return on every bit of investment, and it has to be a reasonable return. And it's difficult to stand in front of learned accountants and senior managers and say, well, we decided to spend all of our capital expenditure on these products and it's made this return, rather than on those products and made 5, 6, 7, 8 times the return. It's just not. You just can't. This doesn't work commercially. So we went through lots of scenarios about how we might revive the fortunes of the fantasy side of what we were doing, and eventually concluded, well, we need to restart it. We need to kickstart it and give it new life and breathe new energy into it and do something radical and left field, and sever it's the legacy, because the legacy itself was going to hold it down. It was holding us down too much. So there was talk about doing all kinds of different things with the setting to try and introduce things or change things around. And in the end, I thought, well, I'll just take an idea I've been working on for some while, for a few years. I've been working on an idea of the different realms and how of the chaos and how those might become battlefields where heroes and villains of myth and legend walked the battlefields, and where your armies could be anything from the past, the present, and the future of the Warhammer world, and totally blow away all the expectations of what could be an army, and create an environment where you could have anything that you wanted. If you wanted to have flying dwarf steamships, you could put them in there, because you could say that those are from the future of the Warhammer world or whatever. That was an idea I was thinking about having, almost to do like a Warhammer Fantasy Battle Advanced or Warhammer Fantasy Battle 2, kind of a sort of a possibly an epic type format. And I had kind of fleshed out the realms and what they were like, and the idea was that they were like staging posts between the Warhammer world and the actual realm of chaos, that you'd have to travel through the land of Gar to get to the realm of chaos. And anyway, so I had this idea, and I thought, well, we could do that. And I said, but the problem is that people will still want their Bretonians. And you kind of go, yeah, it will still be trapped by the legacy, because it would still mean, well, I've done all these dwarf steam flying ships, but you still haven't done Bretonian peasant bowmen in plastic or whatever it would. I know we've done those, but or whatever. When are you going to do forest goblins in plastic? It's like, well, we're never going to do forest goblins in plastic, because we'll never sell enough forest goblins in plastic to pay for the tooling. But yeah, so it was kind of still had those legacy issues. So I put a proposal together that maybe we should just give the Warhammer world a nice narrative conclusion, and then introduce the realms as the new fantasy battle setting. And that was kind of the genus of the idea, really. That's a genus then, not genius, because a lot of people obviously don't think it was genius. And I'm well aware of the criticism of what we did, and I have to say, as a lifelong champion of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and I still believe it's by far a superior game to anything we've ever done 40k. I have to say, I'm a lifelong fan of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. It broke my heart in some ways, I mean, actually really did. It was not an easy decision, but that was kind of the idea, was and some people say, why did you have to kill the Warhammer world? And you go, well, you got to clean sweep, give the designers, give all of those creative people literally a white canvas to paint something new and exciting, amazing on, and they have. I mean, actually, to be perfectly honest, it was, here's the opportunity, guys, and I think the Games Workshop staff, the creative staff, the writers, and the miniature designers and artists have literally done that. I mean, they were creating the most astonishing fantasy miniatures. I mean, again, not to everybody's taste, but then as a commercial project, it ended up being massively successful for Games Workshop. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, really. So that's the potted history.
Sure.
I told you I'd end up being the pantomime villain.
Well, yeah,
I won't take credit for all of the decisions around Age of Sigmar, but it was kind of my idea.
Yeah, and it's obviously it has been borne out commercially, absolutely, in terms of sales and putting Age of Sigmar maybe not on the same level as 40k, but it's certainly been very successful financially, I think, for Games Workshop, hasn't it? It's interesting that you mentioned, though, that sort of legacy and almost the idea to do the clean break, so you kill that universe off so that you give yourself room as a sort of creative team, give yourselves permission to then just think outside the box instead of having to be tied down by the legacy of the Warhammer Fantasy world. But we find ourselves in a time now, less than 10 years later, where actually the Warhammer Fantasy world is going to re-emerge in some form through the old world and that release. And specifically the Bretonians that you mentioned, that people would still want their Bretonians.
I'm not there anymore.
Sure.
So they do what they do. No, there was always a thought that that Fantasy Battle wouldn't die. It wouldn't really go away. It would just be waiting for an opportunity for it to be reborn in a format which was sustainable and doable. And I think Games Workshop's kind of found that their way of doing that. That was always it's kind of difficult when you do something radical and extreme in order to make a change. You can't do that half-heartedly. You have to go 100% in. If you kind of go, but it's okay, everybody. There's a back door where you can still do your Fantasy Battle. You kind of all I've done would have split the vote, if you like. It would just split the attention and split the energy in it, and it still wouldn't have made people the people that were really unhappy and upset. It wouldn't have changed their minds. They'd have still been upset and unhappy. In the same way that Space Marine fans are upset and unhappy when there's a 40k release and it's not more Space Marines, because they're like, well, yeah, I'm not that excited about Tyranids because I collect Space Wolves and they haven't done any new Space Wolf characters for. So one of the things that was apparent to me over all the years at Workshop was that the very character of the product offer, the getting people to really commit to and become very invested in a very specific thing, which was commercially a very successful thing to do, also comes with you're going to leave those people in a almost permanent state of disappointment, because if they're super committed and invested in the Eldar, they don't get a release every month. They don't get a release every year. They might get a release once every 5 years or 3 years or something, and that's clear that we always had some customers that were just permanently disappointed and permanently miserable because we weren't doing the thing that they'd fallen for, that they committed themselves to. In some cases, like body and soul, like really insane. I remember on one time when I was sort of representing Black Library in a con in America, and this guy came up to me and he said, and this was early days of Black Library, sort of said, do you have any books with the Eldar in them? And I went, well, not really. I've got this really super exciting book here about Space Marines, and they've got this fantastic book here about space battles, and oh, this book's really, of course, one of our best sellers. It's by Dan Allen. It's called First and Only. It's one of our best sellers. It's an amazing book. Has that got Eldon in it? Well, no, it's Imperial Guard. Oh no, I can't read it. It's like, but it's a really good book. It's only like $4, the book. And he's like, well, yeah, but if I can't read it if it's not got the Eldon in it. And I said, yeah, you have to explain that to me. But why? It's a really great rip-roaring adventure book set in 40k universe. And he said, yeah, but if I read that, I might fall out of love with the Eldar and want to collect Imperial Guard. And I went, yeah, okay, we haven't got anything for you then. I'll tell you what, though, there's some really nice Eldar models in the painting cabinet over there. And he was so grateful. And then I guess looks at the model. But that's the thing, isn't it? I don't want to read the really great book about the Imperial Guard, because it might make me not like the Eldar as much as I do. And you think, oh. And we've all got a bit of that in us. We've all got a bit of that, like, oh, I love my Marvel comics, and whenever I read a DC comic, I feel a little bit like I'm being a little bit of a disloyal, Enjoy that Batman story quite that much, because that's kind of a little bit of disloyalty there, Silly, isn't it? But that's a real human emotion. So yeah, I'm no spokesman for Modern Games Workshop. I'm interested to see what they do with the old world. I don't think it's going to be a tentpole product. My feeling is it could be a very successful sort of second-rank product. I don't suppose. I have no idea. Maybe it could be massively successful, and I'd have to eat the hat that I'm not wearing. But I was kind of surprised and not surprised that they've led with Bretonians. The reason I'm not surprised is because I kind of have a certain kind of feeling about how the people in Games Workshop think about things. But I am a little bit surprised, because I don't think they're the strongest commercial decision out the gate. Again, one of the most frustrating legacies of Warhammer for me back in the day was that the human armies were not the strongest commercial pieces of Warhammer. Chaos Warriors, elves, either colour, doesn't matter, light ones or dark ones. Skaven, probably quite high, but dwarves always very popular. The Empire, surprisingly, flat. Whenever we did any Empire releases, it was always a bit like, why didn't we sell more of those? They're lovely models, absolutely gorgeous models. And proper Warhammer, but the sales would always be a little bit disappointing.
That is a surprise, yeah, because you would almost see them, although there was never a sort of Space Marines of Warhammer Fantasy, it always often felt like Empire was pretty central, given its place in the story, in the actual literal world. They felt kind of like a way in army, so you might expect them to be a bit more successful.
Yeah, one might. The one thing that was clear is that the armies that we always paired in the starter sets always did very well for the lifetime of that starter set. So obviously there have been periods where the top rated armies in terms of sales would have been those armies for obvious reasons. But the underlying trends were that people in playing fantasy like to collect fantasy models. Again, I could wax lyrical about the difference between the models that people buy and the models that people like to have in their tournament armies, because they're definitely nowhere near the same things. There's again one of those interesting kind of in hobby assumptions that if a unit or a character or an army that is performing well in tournament play, that somehow that translates into those must be the ones that Games Workshop is selling the most models of, and it doesn't always. In fact, it doesn't ever seem to really correlate in any noticeable way with the sales, which is quite surprising in a way. You would have thought. But the number of people that play competitively is relatively small compared to the number of people that go into Games Workshop stores or hobby game stores around the world, or go online and buy miniatures. But, of course, that might have changed in the years I've not been there. I don't know. But,
sure, yeah, and it definitely feels like that tournament competitive world is ever increasing and sort of growing in importance, is the sort of sense that I get, certainly. But yeah, it's interesting to think more in the past maybe wasn't as influential, I guess.
Well, I've heard similar. I've heard similar feedback from very successful collectible card game companies as well.
Right.
That the cards that the decks and cards and the releases that are used that appear in the successful decks aren't necessarily the ones that doesn't necessarily equate to the most collected or the most purchased ones.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because you definitely would. I guess the sort of received wisdom would be that it would drive that kind of thing. But I guess maybe people like the underdog, or they like like you say, people are very committed to the faction that they're invested in and that's taken they're sort of fallen in love with. So maybe that supersedes it.
We used to have basically a saying, and that maybe is to go like something along the lines of 80% of the time is painting the miniatures and 20% of the time is playing with the miniatures. And I'm convinced that this is totally not true. And it actually is more like 80% of the time is owning the miniatures, having them under your bed or in a box in your cupboard, and that's fine. That's perfectly okay. Owning miniatures is a huge part of the hobby. I own vast numbers of miniatures I haven't painted yet and will never paint probably. But owning miniatures is like the vast amount of hobby is owning the miniatures. A little bit of time is painting and modelling the miniatures, and then an infinitesimal amount of time is actually playing games with them. Because you just don't. Yeah, I mean, people want to, and they clearly plan to, and they often really like it. And some people do play mercilessly every week. They might play 2 whole games of their favorite war game. But yeah, the vast majority of the time is actually not playing games with them. And then when you think, well, about tournament play and thinking about tournament play might consume the energies of some people. But really, a lot of the customers, a lot of the fans, a lot of hobbyists, is that what we're really doing? Yeah, maybe.
Well, I'm only a single data point, but it definitely, if you go on me as a sample, then I do support that that bit of analysis there. Yeah, I'm afraid to say it's definitely owning and collecting is a bigger part than certainly painting, but even playing, in my experience.
And we all want to play more. I mean, I mean, it's like you don't think, oh, I love a game of Warhammer or 40k. Well, actually, I never really wanted to play a game of 40k, but I quite like playing Warhammer.
I'm conscious that we're sort of coming to the end of our time now. I just wanted to ask one final question, Alan, which was of the many things that you've been involved in and the many sort of successes over your time at GW, is there one thing that you're particularly proud of the most, or one game that was the sort of most fun to work on, or is it just that actually there were so many great things to be a part of?
I think the latter, really. I mean, it's in the very early years, every single product was a special friend. Sometimes an irritating friend, but it was someone, a thing that you got to know very intimately, and unfortunately, almost always see the flaws in the product in its finished form. It's almost always a taste of regret at the end of the day, thinking, "Oh no, we mucked that up, or we missed that, or we could have done that." But yeah, they were all special in a way that in the later years, just because you do so many, they become less special, and your appreciation for any individual product becomes way less than it was. But there were certainly many highlights throughout the whole of my time at Workshop. I was particularly pleased with the work we did on plastic miniatures through that whole time, having to kind of basically learn that almost off our own bat, and finding creative and interesting ways to adopt the technology and then refine it and work it. Just immensely proud of all that stuff we did. I actually worked on so many different products. It's hard to say which were my favourite ones. I've got a soft spot for the old Warhammer, despite being the villain.
Sure.
So, and I think the apogee of that was Isle of Blood. Island of Blood was just the most amazing product. Amazing plastics. It was kind of, that was what we had in mind, something like that when we did 4th edition.
Right.
in our mind's eye, Island of Blood was what 4th edition was, because no one had ever done it before, and it was groundbreaking in lots of ways. Yeah, those would be the main things. Regrets, I have a few, but I'm not going to talk about them too much.
Sure.
But they're not that far away from some of the gripes that fans would have. Some products just didn't work out very well, or we didn't release them in the right way, and we didn't kind of we didn't realize the opportunity they had. There's 2 specialist games that I think fall into that category that were big, ended up being big disappointments, but were still have huge potential. And one of those was War Master, where we just didn't find a way to put the right kind of investment into War Master. So the original product plan was to have a big box with 2 plastic armies.
Right.
Had we done that, I think War Master would have become much bigger deal than it turned out to be. And I noticed that recently a company called Warlord Games have been releasing some epic games, American Civil War game and then Napoleonic game, which are fundamentally War Master, but with plastic armies.
Hmm.
And they look pretty good, and they're exciting. So that was one big regret. The other one was for a slightly different reason, or related reason maybe. It was Inquisitor, which I thought was one of our most texturally exciting and interesting products. And the original conception was that it would have a elite range of very beautifully produced 54mm scale characters, and they would, each one would be a miniature masterpiece. And yeah, we didn't quite deliver on that. We did our best, but we didn't quite do it. We weren't quite in a position to deliver on it. And again, the fact that we never, we were not at the time in the position to do any of those things as plastic kits, I think ultimately limited the opportunity there. Well, I'd say what the reason I've slightly fixated on the plastics is because there was a watershed moment that we had as a company come sort of 2000-ish. And that was, we crossed the Rubicon as a company. We clearly went from being a company that produced really, really lovely metal miniatures with some plastic kits to becoming a company that produced really, really lovely plastic kits with some metal miniatures. And it's kind of the tipping point is around about the sort of 2000 period. The Warhammer edition that had the Empire and the Orcs in it.
Right.
I won't guess at the number. Is that 5th?
6th, I think.
6th, yeah. At that point, up to that point, plastic kit releases had been okay, it's perfectly exciting, perfectly okay, but not the driving element of a release. After that point, the company internally and externally, the customers started to measure releases on how many plastic kits there were in them, and it's because the standard of the designs started to accelerate at that point. Design skill, for sure, part of that. Technology is a huge part of that. But I tend to measure I tend to use that as a measure for how developed the business was getting. So nowadays it's unbelievable. You cannot imagine that Games Workshop could have a month where the only thing it released was half a dozen metal miniatures. You just couldn't conceive of that being a successful month for the company. And yet actually back in the day, that was kind of our bedrock, really.
I was reading about the release of the Steam Tank, one of the later versions of the Steam Tank, and because it was such a major release, White Dwarf for about 3 or 4 months did article after article after article about it, because it was obviously this a big investment, a lot of effort had gone into it. Nowadays, it's sort of that would be 1 week's release and talked about for a week, and then the next week it's another however many big releases because of the scale and the volume of the production now.
Who remembers the infamous giant issue of White Dwarf? One, because we released a plastic kit of the giant. And that's it.
Sure.
Well, that's the giant issue. God, you got a lot of grief for that.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me, Alan. It's been absolutely fascinating. Yeah, loads of really interesting stuff. So thank you very much for being here.
Welcome. Well, and I hope people don't hold it against me too much. The old Age of Sigmar thing.
Well, I think it's a tough one, isn't it? And like you say, there's business realities that have influenced these things, and we are all passionate and we all love these games and these worlds, and maybe different decisions could have been made, but it's interesting, I think, to understand why those decisions were made, even if I don't necessarily agree with them or might have wanted a different path. It's still fascinating to sort of understand how things went, essentially. And I think that that's an important part of coming to terms with stuff, I suppose.
Well, I'm hoping that the games shall deliver with the old world and make everybody happy again.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Alan, for spending time chatting to me and being so candid and open in your reflections, recollections, and memories of your time at Games Workshop. It really was terrific to talk to you. I hope to see plenty of healthy discussion in the comments. Alan shared so many interesting stories that I'm sure there is loads that people want to talk about. Given that we did touch on the understandably still vexatious topic of the end times, though, I do just want to remind everybody to please stay civil and respectful. This is a safe space for us to have a good discussion about this stuff, to share our reflections and sure, some of our frustrations, but let's do so in as nice and constructive a way as we can. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.